June 6, 1944. The sky over Normandy was still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness when Oberleutnant Sir C. Walter Olmsen lifted his binoculars at the Crisbeck battery and peered toward the English Channel. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from disbelief. Through the grey mist, the horizon seemed to dissolve into a moving wall of steel. The sea, once a protective moat for Hitler's fortress Europe, had transformed overnight into an endless highway of warships, transports, and landing craft stretching beyond sight. What Olmsen witnessed was something no German officer had imagined possible, a sight that defied all confidence in the Reich's impregnability. Before him advanced nearly 7,000 Allied vessels, a living tide of industrial power rolling toward the Normandy coast. The numbers were staggering: 939 ships, 213 warships over 4,000 landing craft, hundreds of auxiliary and merchant vessels, manned by nearly 200 sailors from 8 Allied nations at precisely 5:52 a.m. Olmsen's unit received the order to open fire. 3 minutes later, the 210 mm Czech made coda guns of his battery thundered to life, their shells arching toward the horizon. It was a symbolic gesture, a few raindrops hurled against an oncoming tsunami. The German coastal guns managed to hit the USS Corrie, the only American destroyer sunk on D-Day, but such minor victories barely registered against the immensity of what was unfolding. From his concrete bunker, Olmsen became the first German officer to engage the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. Yet what he saw through his Zeiss rangefinder was more than a fleet. It was a physical manifestation of an industrial capability that Nazi propaganda had insisted the Allies lacked. For years, the German High Command had assured its officers that the enemy was fragmented, weak, incapable of sustaining large-scale operations, but the mathematics of defeat were now visible on the water. The invasion fleet moved at 8 knots, and with it sailed the future. Within hours, German officers across Normandy would experience a shattering revelation. They were no longer fighting an enemy defined by manpower or tactics, but by sheer material superiority, factories, machines, and supply chains beyond comprehension. The warning signs had come the night before. At Army Group B headquarters 50 miles inland, Lieutenant General Hans Spadel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had monitored disturbing reports. Rommel himself was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced that the stormy weather made any invasion impossible. Yet in the early hours of June 6th, reports poured in massive parachute drops across Normandy. Over 13,000 men from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were descending from Douglas C-47 aircraft, scattering behind German lines. In his command post at St. Lo, General Erich Marx, a one-legged veteran of Stalingrad and commander of the LXX Civ Corps, immediately recognized the scale of the assault. Even for a seasoned officer hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front, the magnitude of what he faced was beyond imagination. Germany had prepared for an invasion, just not this one. The Reich's defensive plans were modeled on its own dwindling resources and experiences from earlier campaigns. They had anticipated perhaps 20 divisions supported by 3,000 ships. What appeared that morning was more than double that estimate, the culmination of years of Allied coordination and industrial mobilization. As dawn broke, coastal observers from Cherbourg to Le Havre sent in panicked reports, not hundreds, but thousands of ships advancing toward them. What had been assumed a mere raid was, in fact, the largest amphibious assault in human history. At strongpoint WN-62, overlooking what would soon be called Omaha Beach 20, old Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh peered through the embrasure of his MG-42 position. A farm boy from Lower Saxony who had never seen the ocean before his posting to Normandy, he now saw no water at all, only steel. There were ships everywhere. He would later write, big ships, small ships, flat, bottomed ones, destroyers racing like sheepdogs. The horizon was gone. Like countless others, he stopped counting after the first 100. There were too many. By 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment began and the world seemed to explode. 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, and 65 destroyers unleashed a barrage of unimaginable force. The USS Texas alone fired 255 14-inch shells in the first hour, 178 tons of explosives from one ship. Before any soldier set foot on the beach, the Allied fleet had already fired more ammunition than many German divisions possessed in total reserves. As General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to the German Commander-in-Chief West, later admitted, "We had prepared to fight soldiers. We found ourselves fighting factories." In that first light over Normandy, Walter Olmsson and his comrades understood what they were truly witnessing. The invasion fleet that filled the Channel was not just an army crossing the sea. It was the visible expression of industrial warfare, the moment when material power eclipsed ideology, and when the myth of German invincibility began to crumble under the weight of sheer production. As dawn broke fully over the beaches of Normandy, the Allied bombardment gave way to the next phase of the invasion, the landing of men, tanks, and machines that would decide the fate of Europe. The thunder of naval guns faded only slightly before it was replaced by the rhythmic growl of landing craft engines approaching the shore. The sea, still shrouded in smoke, seemed alive, filled with thousands of small, dark silhouettes advancing relentlessly toward the coastline. From his vantage point, German gunner Heinrich Severloh at strongpoint WN-62 watched in grim fascination as the first assault boats came within range. His MG-42 machine gun, positioned perfectly to command a field of fire over Omaha Beach, opened up at 6:30 a.m. The storm of bullets that followed tore into the first waves of American infantry, transforming the beach into a vision of chaos and death. The men of the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions stepped into waist, deep water under a storm of fire that defied belief. Within minutes, hundreds lay dead or wounded, their bodies tossed by the waves or tangled in barbed wire. The sea turned crimson as landing craft after landing craft unloaded men into the slaughter. The German defences, meticulously designed with interlocking fields of fire, appeared to have fulfilled their purpose. In those terrible moments, some German officers even believed the Atlantic Wall might hold. The resistance nests, concrete bunkers reinforced by steel and rock, spat fire from every direction. Mortar shells and machine gun rounds shredded men as they sought cover behind the sparse beach obstacles. The scene was one of mechanical destruction, man against metal, courage against calculated engineering. Yet even amid this carnage, the tide of history was shifting. The Allies had not placed their faith solely in courage or surprise, but in an overwhelming weight of material power. At approximately 8:00 a.m., as the situation on Omaha Beach grew critical and reports reached General Omar Bradley offshore that the assault might fail, a decision was made that would alter the course of the battle. American destroyers, realizing that their comrades were being pinned down, took an unprecedented risk. Ignoring the danger of grounding or striking hidden mines, they closed to within 1,000 yards of the shoreline point, blank range for naval guns. Ships such as the USS McCook, USS Carmick, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt swung their massive guns toward individual German strongpoints and opened fire. From such proximity, their accuracy was devastating. Bunkers that had withstood hours of aerial bombardment and shellfire were blown apart in minutes. German gun crews were vaporized, concrete positions shattered like glass. One naval officer would later write that it was as though the ships had turned their guns into surgical instruments, cutting out the nerve centers of the German defense. This action, recorded in naval and German reports alike, marked the decisive moment at Omaha Beach. It was then that the defenders began to realize the full scale of the Allied industrial machine. The Americans could risk destroyers worth millions because they could build hundreds more. The loss of one ship was nothing in a war measured by mass production. Walter Olmsson, still observing from his command post at the Crisbeck Battery, watched as wave after wave of landing craft continued to pour men and vehicles onto the beaches. The sight defied logic. Every time a vessel was destroyed, another appeared to take its place. The Allies had built a logistical chain so vast that it seemed inexhaustible. From specialized amphibious vehicles like the Duckworth trucks, which could swim ashore and deliver supplies directly to advancing units, to massive landing ship tanks LSTS that disgorged entire companies of Shermans onto the sand, every aspect of the assault had been planned with mechanical precision. What the Germans faced was not merely an army, but a conveyor belt of war, an unending stream of men, machines, and material flowing from sea to land. By nightfall, the Allies had achieved what many German commanders had deemed impossible. They had established a secure foothold on French soil. Nearly 156,000 troops had been landed, 132,700, 115 by sea and 23,400 by air. Alongside them came over 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and more than 15,000 tons of supplies. The sheer volume of men and equipment delivered in a single day eclipsed the entire strength of the German 7th Army defending Normandy. It was a victory not only of bravery, but of industrial organization, of logistics, and engineering on a scale that stunned the German command structure. For the defenders, the realization was devastating. Their vaunted Atlantic Wall, the pride of Hitler's defensive vision, had been broken in less than 24 hours. Even their most powerful units, like the 21st Panzer Division, could do little to stem the tide. Air power and naval guns shattered any counterattack before it could gather momentum. German soldiers who had spent months fortifying the coast now faced an enemy that could replace every loss instantly, repair damage faster than it could be inflicted, and continue advancing regardless of casualties. It was as if the very laws of war had changed overnight. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were strewn with wreckage, the bodies of soldiers, twisted steel from landing craft, and the burnt-out remains of tanks. Smoke drifted inland, marking the beginning of a campaign that would grind the German war machine into dust. For the men who had fired their guns that morning in defiance of the impossible, the day ended with the recognition that they were fighting not just an army, but an entire industrial civilization. The invasion had not merely breached the walls of Fortress Europe, it had exposed the fatal weakness at the heart of the German war effort, a nation of limited means facing an alliance that could manufacture victory. In the days following June 6, 1944, the magnitude of the Allied invasion became fully apparent to the German command. The once proud Atlantic Wall, proclaimed by Hitler as an unbreakable shield, had been pierced and shattered. From Cherbourg to Keene, reports arrived that painted the same picture. The beaches had fallen, and the enemy was advancing inland in unstoppable numbers. What began as disbelief turned to dread, and by June 7th, German officers across Normandy were forced to confront an unprecedented reality. They were not merely outnumbered, they were outproduced, outmaneuvered, and out-supplied. The war they had been trained to fight, a war of maneuver, courage, and tactical genius, no longer existed. It had been replaced by something new, a war of machines and factories. The first German attempts to counterattack exposed just how powerless they had become under the shadow of Allied supremacy. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Keene and the only armoured formation close enough to react on D-Day, received orders to drive the invaders back into the sea. Its commander, General Edgar Feuchtinger, launched his tanks at 4:00 p.m. On June 6th, the division's advance covered a mere 10 miles, but it took 3 agonizing hours. Every movement was slowed by constant air attacks and naval bombardments. Allied forward observers directed the fire of battleships miles offshore, turning the once proud panzer columns into lines of burning wrecks. When the survivors finally reached the outskirts of the British landing zone near Sword Beach, they were met not by disorganized troops, but by a coordinated wall of artillery and naval gunfire that annihilated their assault before it began. Among the officers witnessing this disaster was SS Standarten for Kurtmeyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment. His men had fought on the Eastern Front against Soviet tank armies and endured unimaginable conditions. Yet even he would later admit that what he faced in Normandy was beyond comparison. The enemy's material superiority was so great. He wrote after the war that our own strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock. His words captured the essence of what the German army faced: not just superior numbers, but the physical embodiment of industrial power, a war machine that could absorb loss and strike harder with every passing day. On June 7th, German reconnaissance aircraft returned with photographs that stunned the High Command. The Allies were not simply occupying captured ports, they were building their own. In the open sea, artificial harbours codenamed mulberries were taking shape. Prefabricated in Britain and towed across the Channel, these massive engineering marvels consisted of concrete caissons, floating piers, and sunken ships that formed protective barriers. Within 2 weeks, they were capable of unloading 90 tons of supplies daily, more than many major French ports could handle in peacetime. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying the coast to defend its harbours. The Allies had rendered those defences irrelevant by constructing new ports from scratch. It was an act of engineering genius and logistical foresight that defied comprehension. Meanwhile, the air war over Normandy became a massacre. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been reduced to a shell of its former self. On D-Day, it had managed only 319 sorties in all of France, compared to over 14,000 Allied flights. For every German aircraft in the sky, there were 6 Allied planes. By mid-June, German commanders could no longer move troops, tanks, or even fuel during daylight without suffering devastating losses. Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, patrolled the skies in continuous cab ranks, striking targets within minutes of being reported by forward observers. Roads became graveyards of burnt vehicles. The legendary panzer divisions that had once stormed across Europe were now pinned down, unable to maneuver, their every move tracked and destroyed from the air. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, returned to Normandy on June 8th to find the situation already beyond recovery. Touring the front, he was horrified by what he saw. Roads clogged with wreckage, broken supply lines, and soldiers demoralized by the constant bombardment. When he met Hitler on June 17th at Margeval, Rommel presented the grim truth: complete Allied air supremacy, divisions at 30% strength, and the impossibility of conducting operations in daylight. Hitler's response was madness cloaked in fanaticism. He forbade any withdrawal and demanded that his armies fight to the last man. Rommel left the meeting knowing that Germany's defeat was now only a matter of time. Within a month, he would be implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler and forced to take his own life. While the Allies consolidated their foothold and pushed inland, German commanders struggled to understand how their intelligence had failed so catastrophically. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception campaign, had convinced the German High Command that the Normandy landings were merely a diversion. The real invasion, they believed, would come at the Pas de Calais, led by General George S. Patton and his fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group. For weeks, German reinforcements were held back, waiting for an attack that would never come. By the time they realized the truth, it was far too late. The Allies had already landed hundreds of thousands of men and tons of equipment, turning the beaches into a logistical juggernaut. Generalfeld Marschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, eventually summed up the hopelessness of the situation in a single, desperate exchange with Berlin. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel demanded to know what should be done to stop the invasion, Rundstedt replied bitterly, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" For that moment of honesty, he was immediately relieved of his command. The German military elite, once confident in their tactical brilliance, now found themselves powerless against an enemy that fought with production lines instead of strategy. By late June, the German front in Normandy had devolved into a defensive nightmare. Every counterattack was obliterated by bombers before it began. Every strongpoint was reduced by naval fire that reached miles inland. The myth of German invincibility, nurtured through 5 years of conquest, was collapsing under the relentless weight of Allied industry. What the defenders had once considered a battle for Europe had become something far greater, a confrontation between two worlds, one built on ideology, the other on machines. And as the weeks passed, the outcome was becoming unmistakably clear. The Germans were not losing a war of courage or tactics, they were being erased by mathematics. By late July 1944, nearly 2 months after the landings, the battle for Normandy had transformed from a coastal struggle into a brutal contest of attrition. The once compact beachhead had expanded into a sprawling front filled with dust, wreckage, and exhaustion. The Allies, though battered and bloodied, were continuously reinforced. Each day brought new tanks, trucks, and supplies flowing through the Mulberry harbours and improvised ports. For the Germans, however, every day meant dwindling resources, shrinking fuel reserves, and mounting losses. The Wehrmacht's famed discipline could not compensate for the simple arithmetic of war. They were fighting an enemy whose strength grew with every passing hour. By mid-summer, the German command understood that holding Normandy was no longer about victory, it was about survival. The climax of this grinding campaign came with the launch of Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. On July 25, 1944, after weeks of rain and stalled progress, the skies finally cleared. What followed was an aerial bombardment of unprecedented scale. At precisely 9:38 a.m., waves of Allied bombers appeared on the horizon, a vast armada of steel and thunder filling the morning sky. The U.S. First Army had requested a concentrated strike to smash open the German front near St. Lo, and the Allies delivered with overwhelming force. Over 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers dropped 300 tons of explosives across a narrow front only 6,000 by 200 yards. The air vibrated with the roar of engines and the detonation of thousands of bombs, shaking the earth and darkening the sky with smoke. For those on the ground, it was the end of the world. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Lehr Division, was positioned directly beneath the bombardment. His unit, once one of Germany's most formidable armoured forces, was obliterated in less than an hour. After the attack, Bayerlein sent a message to headquarters that became infamous. "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting an army, we are fighting an industrial complex. The Panzer Lehr Division, which had entered Normandy with 190 tanks and 16 Zero men, simply ceased to exist. Of the 3 men in the targeted zone, 1/3 were killed instantly, another third wounded, and the rest psychologically shattered beyond combat readiness." The power of the attack defied any previous concept of warfare. It was not strategy or maneuver, but mechanical devastation on a scale that rendered human bravery irrelevant. Even the Americans suffered from the immense violence of their own weaponry. Miscommunication and wind drift caused several bombs to fall short, killing 111 American soldiers and wounding nearly 500, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair the highest-ranking U.S. officer to die in combat in Europe. Yet despite these tragic losses, the operation achieved its objective. The German front line had been vaporized, their units obliterated or scattered. For the first time since D-Day, the Americans broke through the German defenses and poured into open country. What had once been a stalemate became a rout. The breakthrough unleashed the full might of Allied mobility and logistics. Columns of Sherman tanks, armored cars, and supply trucks surged forward across the French countryside, exploiting gaps in the crumbling German line. The German army, deprived of fuel and harried from the air, could not reform or retreat in good order. Allied fighter bombers prowled the roads, strafing any sign of movement. The Luftwaffe barely existed, its remaining aircraft destroyed on the ground or driven from the skies. By early August, the German forces in Normandy were being encircled. What remained of their divisions, once symbols of Hitler's military prowess, were collapsing into disorganized fragments. The culmination came in mid-August with the Falaise Pocket, a massive encirclement between the towns of Falaise, Trun, and Chambois. The trap closed between August 12th and 21st, and what occurred inside was nothing short of apocalyptic. Under relentless air and artillery assault, the German 7th Army and Panzer Group West were systematically destroyed. Columns of retreating vehicles jammed the narrow roads, only to be shredded by Allied aircraft that attacked in continuous waves. Entire convoys were turned into twisted fields of wreckage. Tanks burned, horses screamed, and the roads became rivers of fire and death. The stench of burning fuel and bodies hung over the battlefield for days. The statistics tell the grim story. Between 10,000 and 15,000 Germans killed, 40,000 to 50,000 captured, and 344 tanks destroyed in the northern sector alone. Another 447 vehicles and 252 artillery pieces were abandoned. Between 20,000 and 50,000 soldiers managed to escape, but they did so as shattered remnants, no longer functioning units. The German army in France had been broken beyond recovery. Normandy had become a graveyard of the Wehrmacht, the battlefield where German military tradition met the cold logic of Allied industrial superiority. For the surviving German officers, the psychological impact was profound. They had entered the campaign believing in tactical brilliance, discipline, and courage as the decisive elements of war. They emerged from it understanding that none of these could overcome a foe with limitless material resources. Germany was no longer being defeated in the field, it was being out-manufactured. The Allies could replace tanks and aircraft faster than the Germans could destroy them. Every German loss was permanent, every Allied loss was temporary. As one officer bitterly remarked, they fought with machines, not men, and the machines never tired. The final lesson of Normandy was brutally simple. The Third Reich, for all its propaganda about superiority and destiny, had entered a contest it could never win. Against an enemy whose factories could produce 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and 650,000 trucks in a single year, German valor was meaningless. The industrial war had reached its logical conclusion. By August 1944, the fields of Normandy were littered with the evidence: thousands of burnt tanks, endless rows of captured soldiers, and the wreckage of an ideology that had mistaken willpower for power itself. The road to Paris now lay open. The German army, once the instrument of European domination, was in full retreat. Behind it marched the relentless machinery of Allied production, a force that had proven more decisive than any general or strategy. Normandy had not only liberated France, it had rewritten the very meaning of warfare. The age of industrial conquest had arrived, and with it, the realization that victory no longer belonged to the boldest or the bravest, but to those who could build the most. When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke over Normandy cleared, what remained was not merely a battlefield, but revelation. The German army had been crushed, not only militarily but philosophically. Its officers, raised in the traditions of Clausewitz and Schlieffen, had witnessed something no theory of war had prepared them for: the supremacy of industry over strategy. The campaign in Normandy, culminating in the destruction of the Wehrmacht's Western forces, had proven that in the modern era, war was no longer the domain of generals and tactics, but of engineers, factories, and logistics. It was a war measured not in divisions, but in tons of steel and gallons of fuel. The statistics themselves told a story of inevitability. In 1944 alone, German industry produced 39,000 aircraft, fewer than half the number built by the United States. German tank production peaked at 1,854 per month, while America was turning out nearly 29,000 that same year. In trucks, the lifeblood of mobility, the disparity was even greater. Germany produced just 68,000 military trucks in 1944. The U.S. produced over 650,000. The Allies were not simply fighting a war, they were running a global production line that converted resources into victory at a rate the Axis could not hope to match. For every German tank destroyed in Normandy, 3 more Allied tanks rolled ashore. For every aircraft lost, dozens waited in British hangars ready to take its place. The Germans were not defeated, as one captured general would later remark, they were mathematically eliminated. This realization shattered the illusions of an entire generation of German officers. They had been taught that courage, discipline, and tactical brilliance could overcome any obstacle. Yet in Normandy, they had faced an opponent who rendered those virtues obsolete through mechanized abundance. For many, it was a psychological collapse as much as a military one. Suicide among officers spiked sharply during the final year of the war. Some could not bear the truth that their defeat was not due to cowardice or betrayal, but to a system of industrial warfare that had outgrown their understanding. The United States and its allies had turned war into a science of production, an extension of the assembly line, where precision, efficiency, and scale replaced valor and instinct. The technological gap they witnessed was equally staggering. German anti-aircraft crews found their fire suddenly useless against Allied planes, equipped with radar and proximity fuses devices that detonated shells when near their targets, turning the sky into a killing field. Naval bombardments were guided by radar so accurate that ships could strike targets miles inland with the first round. Amphibious vehicles like the Duckworth trucks blurred the line between land and sea, solving logistical problems the Germans had never even imagined. The British Hobart's fun is tanks modified to lay bridges, clear mines, and breach fortifications turned engineering into a weapon system. Every problem the Allies faced was met with invention, and every invention multiplied their advantage. To German soldiers, the Allied fleet and air arms seemed inexhaustible. The battleship HMS Rodney, with its 16-inch guns, could lob shells weighing over a ton more than 20 miles inland. The USS Nevada, once crippled at Pearl Harbor, now pounded German defenses with terrifying precision. Each naval vessel operated as a mobile artillery battery, supported by radar, aircraft, and supply chains that never faltered. German artillery, by contrast, was powerless immobile, under constant air attack, and short on ammunition. Even attempting counter-battery fire against naval ships was an act of futility. The vessels moved constantly, returning fire with devastating speed and accuracy. As one German officer grimly noted, they fired faster, they hit farther, and they never ran out of shells. By July 1944, daylight movement for German forces in France had become impossible. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, flying between 50 and 80 sorties a day. German planes, reduced to a few hundred operational fighters, could manage only a fraction of that. Any attempt to move tanks or reinforcements in daylight was suicide. Supply convoys had to travel at night along cratered roads under blackout conditions, often only to find their destinations obliterated by the next morning. The Wehrmacht, once a model of efficiency, had become a broken organism, suffocated by the enemy's total control of air and sea. When the Normandy campaign ended on August 30th, 1944, the figures were staggering. The Allies had landed over 5 million men, 438,000 vehicles, and nearly 4 million tons of supplies. They had flown more than 480,000 sorties and established logistical superiority that would carry them all the way to Germany. In contrast, German losses were catastrophic: more than 240,000 killed, 200,000 captured, and over 200 tanks and assault guns destroyed. 40 divisions had been effectively wiped out. What had begun as a defense of Fortress Europe had ended as an industrial autopsy of the Third Reich. 10 years later, in 1954, Surviving German officers gathered in Bonn for a private symposium on the Normandy campaign. Among them were men who had once commanded corps and divisions during the invasion, sober, gray-haired veterans now forced to confront what their defeat had meant. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as chief of staff to both von Rundstedt and Kluge, delivered the keynote address. His words echoed with the clarity of hard-earned truth. We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally. It was no longer a contest of armies, but of economic systems. We counted divisions, they counted factories. We measured courage, they measured production. The image that haunts me still is the sight of American bulldozers pushing aside our destroyed tanks to clear roads for their supply trucks. The lessons of that war extended far beyond the battlefield. Men like Hans Spadel, Rommel's former chief of staff, later became architects of NATO and advocates for European unity. They had learned, through defeat, that the only hope for Europe's future lay in cooperation, not conquest. The dream of domination had been replaced by the necessity of integration. Only by pooling industrial power could nations hope to prevent another imbalance of such magnitude. The same industrial capacity that had crushed Germany would later rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan and create a new order founded not on ideology, but on production and prosperity. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Olmsen, the German naval officer who had first sighted the invasion fleet, returned to the Crisbeck battery. Now 73 years old, he stood once again at his old observation post, looking over the peaceful sea where he had once seen the impossible. Speaking to gathered veterans from both sides, he reflected quietly, 40 years ago, I stood here and saw the horizon covered with ships. I knew then that everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations do not build 7,000 ships. Divided nations do not coordinate such an invasion. I fired my guns at that armada, but it was like throwing stones at the tide. His words captured what every German officer who survived Normandy had come to understand, that D-Day was not merely an invasion, but a revelation. The fleet that crossed the Channel on June 6, 1944, was not just an army in transit. It was the physical embodiment of Allied industrial power, the transformation of democracy into an engine of war. Those 7,000 ships carried more than men and weapons. They carried the proof that in the modern world, industrial capacity is military capacity. The war they fought and lost was not decided by courage or cunning, but by assembly lines, refineries, and the relentless output of free societies united in purpose. For the German officers who watched that armada approach, the truth had been clear even then. They were witnessing not just the beginning of defeat, but the birth of a new kind of warfare, a war in which equations would replace strategies, and production would outweigh valor. Their defeat had not been military, but mathematical, not a failure of will, but a shortage of steel, oil, and trucks. The waves that crashed on Normandy's beaches carried not only soldiers, but the future, the age of industrial war, where factories, not fortresses, decided the fate of nations. And from that moment onward, nothing in the world of war would ever be the same again.